Welcome to Ethics Matter. I'm Stephanie Tsai. Our guest today at the Carnegie Council is Kate Brown, a professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, as well as the author of Plutopia, Nuclear Families in Atomic Cities and the Great Soviet and American Plutonium Disasters. Kate is currently researching the long-term environmental and health impacts of the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Kate, welcome to the Carnegie Council. It's so nice to meet you, and I think the Chernobyl disaster is a good place to start because a lot of people believe that was the greatest nuclear disaster of all time. You started researching that, and that brought you to another nuclear disaster that nobody talks about.
That's right. I call them the plutonium, the great plutonium disasters, because when I was looking at Chernobyl, I realized that the estimated amount of radiation spilled in Chernobyl is 50 to 100 million curies, and that's a lot. But there were these two other places where they made plutonium during the Cold War, the Hanford plutonium plant in eastern Washington state, and the Mayak plutonium plant in the southern Russian Urals, what had been the Soviet Union. They each issued about the same number, 350 million curies, almost twice or 4 times Chernobyl. I thought, that's so strange. Chernobyl's a household word. Since 2011, Fukushima has been a household word. But nobody's really heard of Mayak or even Hanford in this country. And I wondered why that was the case. And of course, there's the obvious answer, which is that Chernobyl and Fukushima were both big accidents. They were really camera-ready events, and the stories was covered by the international news media, and nightly we watched the disaster unfold until the news cycle ended. Where with Hanford and Mayak, they were both military sites, and they were kept under lock and key for 40 years.
What time period was this?
Well, yeah, 1942, they broke ground on Hanford. In 1946, they broke ground on the Mayak plant. So
they were producing plutonium into the 80s,
That's
early
right.
80s. Okay.
That's right. Really up until Chernobyl. As I looked into it, about why these places were so unknown, the other thing I realized is that this colossal amount of radiation spilled, 350 million curies, so there were some accidents, but most of that environmental degradation occurred as part of the normal working order.
Of just producing plutonium,
processing plutonium. Every day
they
process plutonium. You take about 100 tons of uranium and you distill it down to a kilogram of softball size of plutonium. All the rest is waste. And that waste, they dumped it into the rivers, up the smokestacks, into what they called reverse wells, holes in the ground, trenches in the ground. They did with the waste, this high-tech, toxic waste, what humans have always done with their waste. And that really floored me when I realized that these were disasters by design. An intentional working order. They did this, and I thought, these aren't small bomb labs. They're big factories. 40, 50,000 people worked in these places over the 4 decades they were in operation. And I could only find one KGB agent who blew the whistle in 4 decades.
I want to get into all the health impacts, but one of the things that's so interesting about your book, Plutopia, is it's not just about the health impacts. It's about the way in which government and corporations created a community around plutonium manufacturing that made these 2 Cold War, ostensibly totally different cities on opposite sides of the Cold War have a lot in common. And it is actually why you called the book Plutopia. Echoes of utopia, of course.
Right.
In that.
Yeah, that's a word I made up, putting together plutonium and utopia. And the reason I called it that, because I was trying to figure out, why did all these people live in these places, these working class people, and agree to labor practices and environmental practices that sullied their own environment and put themselves and their families in danger? And I finally realized that both places had very similar technologies, but also very similar social structures. Each had a secret, closed nuclear city attached to the plant that were exclusively reserved for workers and management at the plutonium plant.
Okay.
And these are what I call plutopias. And they were wonderful places. People loved them. They were subsidized.
And that was by design.
And that was by design. They were places, because they built these places with prisoners in the Soviet Union and migrant labor in the United States and prisoners. And they found that the single migrant laborers, whether they were prisoners or soldiers or just migrant workers, they brawled and they boozed and they murdered and raped. And they were, and they thought, oh my God, we can't. Who's going to produce plutonium? We can't have a working class that's as volatile as the product.
So those people built the plants, but they didn't want them to stay working with this volatile substance because they were volatile people.
That's right. They found, mostly men, single migrant men, created a lot of trouble. And so what if one of them, throws a spanner in the works of a plutonium
because
plant?
they were aware of the dangers.
They were
okay,
very
so where
aware.
do they find the workers for the plutonium?
So they go, well, we need to have safe workers. We need reliable, dependent workers who are silent and submissive.
Okay.
Do what the bosses say. What better feature for in these new atomic cities than to bring in the nuclear family?
Okay.
So they bring in mom, dad, kids, no extended families.
Middle class families?
Working class.
Okay.
And these working class families, imagine the 1930s in the United States, think of Steinbeck.
Yeah.
Hard scrabble places. People come in from mining towns in New Mexico. They're thrilled to have a job and a nice apartment or house with appliances and amenities.
And this is given to them?
This is given to them
by
if you
the
work
nuclear
there.
plant?
Right.
And these are
which is
owned
paid for by the federal government. So
Okay.
the land. So Richland, Washington, was a very strange place. It was the arsenal of democracy, but there wasn't a bit of the features of the American democracy in that town. It was owned by the federal government. It was run by the corporation. There was no elections. There was no private property. DuPont and GE selected all the businesses, and then they gave everybody monopolies. And then when they started to raise prices and gouge the consumers, they set prices. And so journalists would come in and they'd say, what is this?
What's going
is
on
this
here?
fascism? Is this socialism?
Right.
It was anything but American-style democratic capitalism. On the Soviet side, they were looking at Los Alamos, and they saw that the Manhattan Project had made a city, surrounded it with a barbed wire fence, gave everybody a pass, even babies had passes on their diapers, and made a controlled system. They said, oh, that's a good idea, we'll make that. And so they created a closed nuclear city with gates and guards, and only allowed in workers who had passes who worked in those plants. And then they supplied them wonderful schools with PhDs teaching. So the working class get social mobility for their kids. 30% more wages than other working class people around. As I said, great housing. The shops in the Soviet Union were always a problem to get supplies. They were supplied like the top leadership in Moscow.
So they were living like kings among the working class. And there's a line in the introduction of your book which sort of sums up this part, which reads, as Plutopia matured, residents gave up their civil and biological rights for consumer rights. So post-1930s, it makes a lot of sense that they might be willing to do that. I guess my question is, did people at the time when they were signing up to work at the plutonium factory, did they understand that there were risks at that time, and were they educated about them?
Yes and no. In the records of the management, DuPont calls this a super poisonous product, plutonium. They understood it was highly toxic. If a human ingested it, it was going to be a critical problem for their health. In the Soviet Union, they described this as a front. And people die at the front, and we might have some casualties here too.
So a war analogy.
That's right. It was sort of a militarized notion. Those ideas get erased over time. So in the 1930s, they had a very good sense of the kind of damage that radiation caused to humans, genetic and other kinds of damage. That knowledge gets forgotten and glossed over as the Cold War production of weapons morphs into the Cold War production of nuclear power and radioactive isotopes for medical uses. And more there is a push to gloss over potential health effects, to not ask questions, not do studies. And that, I think, is something we have yet to really address or rectify. So all throughout the National Cancer Institute, I went to ask the acting director at the time during the Cold War, why were there no studies at the U.S. National Cancer Institute between the connection between radiation and cancer? He said, well, of course we knew there was a connection between radiation and cancer, but to ask that question would be to go political, and no scientist wants to go political.
Wow. There is another aspect of this, and I want to go back to the health issues when we talk about your current work with Chernobyl. But you were also pointing out in Plutopia the socioeconomic inequalities that were baked into this arrangement of the Plutopia, the community that sort of had all of these gifts really from the government, upward mobility, schooling, education, stability, stable jobs. What was happening in the communities around where the plutonium was being manufactured? Did they have those benefits?
Yeah, that's a critical question. So to get a job at either of these plants, you needed to get a security clearance. And to be not deemed a security risk, you needed to be white and of the majority population. So in the United States, that really translated into a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. There are some Catholics, there are a few Jews in Richland. Until 1951, there are no African Americans at all and no Mexican Americans, although and Indians, and that's a population of which there were plenty of people like that out in eastern Washington at the time. In Russia, it was coded as mostly Russian, Ukrainian. The Muslim minority in that area, Bashkirs and Tatars, also were considered a security threat, not hired. So, you know, this is a very dangerous business to produce plutonium. They
and
knew
like
people were watching.
You write, radioactive byproducts recognize no boundaries.
Right, it went everywhere.
So even if they weren't allowed the security clearance and living within the plutopias that you write about, they would have potentially been exposed to the byproducts of the production of plutonium.
And also, you know, they realize that, okay, workers are getting sick. We have these people are looking to see if people will get sick in these towns, so we can't have that. So if a worker who was monitored, and they had these badges, got too much of a dose, they pulled them off the dirty jobs, but somebody still needed to do the dirty jobs. Who's going to do them? So they solved that problem too in the Soviet Union, they sent in soldiers and prisoners, and they did the work of digging trenches in radioactive land, of doing the plumbing with ragingly hot pipes, of standing guard in smoggy, under yellow smog that was full of radioactive gas. In the United States, they sent in minority workers to do those jobs, and also soldiers, many of whom were also minorities over the years. So what you get are these two tiers of labor: the selected residents of Plutopia, paid better, universal health care, safer jobs, and those who live just outside the boundaries, whether they are farmers or migrant workers or prisoners or soldiers, who were getting more of that radiation. But they were migrant. They moved in, they moved out, and when they left, they took with them the radioactive isotopes they had ingested, any future health problems, and any epidemiological trace.
Going back to the comparison of the amount of radiation that was leaked, that's the word you used, from these plants, what does the soil and the water look like today in those places?
Yeah, the Hanford plant is on the Columbia River. It's a high-volume mountain river with lots of water rushing by. At the peak of production, they dumped in 19,000 curies a day of radioactive waste. So that affected the fish in the river, the people who ate the fish in the river, who are often the local indigenous tribes, and sports fishermen. And they started to see patterns in the 70s of cancer shadows along the Columbia River in Oregon and down at the mouth of the river. The crabs.
How long did it take to start seeing those cases?
Usually the latency period for cancer is about a dozen years.
Okay.
So in the 1970s, the first study comes up. The Atomic Energy Commission gets a rival study, sort of smears that scientist, that public
So the Department of Energy has its own scientists that come up with their own
study. They still do, yeah.
Studies that would support continuing nuclear energy generation.
That tends to be the conclusions that they draw. Traditionally what I found over 4 decades. It's kind of the science was an interesting science in that it didn't ask a lot of critical questions, and they didn't go out into the community very much to monitor people who were drinking radioactive milk, farming on radioactive fields. But they did do some studies that said, we found nothing, and they would maybe look at 20 people and find 2 cases. Actually,
it's not a very big sample.
Exactly. So those are the kind of studies. They're sort of a crackpot science, I would call it. And then they found...
You would call these government scientists crackpot scientists?
I would, and if you look at the science today, I think a lot of people would agree that they weren't really asking the critical questions that needed to be asked.
Because they were trying to serve a political agenda.
Well, it's when I asked, one source said, well, sure, we could have done those studies, but what if we had found something?
Then you have Chernobyl, which happens in 1986. Is there a full reckoning at that point? The degree, the sort of photo-ready disaster, the fact that it was so well publicized, and that it really became sort of the scary nuclear disaster that everyone talked about, at least until Fukushima years later. Was there a reckoning at that time that the health impacts of nuclear, that the potential environmental and health impacts really needed to be considered before, continuation of nuclear energy or nuclear weaponry development?
Yeah, a lot of panic when that, story broke. It was still during the Cold War, so, scientists in the West were saying that the Soviets, aren't telling us everything, and they're holding back information, and their first instinct was to, inflame. The scientists in the West said there are 2,000 dead, and the Soviets were saying we only have 2 dead, and this back and forth was going. And everybody, whether they were in the Soviet Union or outside, were saying we need to have a long-term epidemiological study of the people who've been impacted by this disaster, so we can finally answer this question about long-term chronic doses of radiation. And you just hear scientists saying it in the International Atomic Energy Association, in World Health, in the Soviet leadership, in the American research institutes. And Stephanie, the one thing that's never happened is there's never been a long-term epidemiological study of Chernobyl health effects.
That is so surprising.
There's been a series of small ones. The big study was going to get funded by the UN in 1990. They held a pledge drive, but the International Atomic Energy Agency and World Health Organization did a preliminary assessment in which they said that we find no health effects from Chernobyl 5 years later, and we think there won't be any in the future other than perhaps a few thyroid cancers.
What's so worrying about that, Kate, is that you think of the World Health Organization as being this apolitical, independent organization. You think of the IAEA, which for those that don't know is the nuclear watchdog agency. They oversee inspections, and for example, in Iran, to verify the Iran deal, things like that, that these are independent agencies with integrity. And yet you're saying they said we don't need to look long term at these concepts. Why?
That's exactly
why is
what they said. Well, I don't mean to besmirch the agencies. They're responsible agencies, and the International Atomic Energy Agency does, try to keep the world from blowing itself up and to keep, both nuclear power and nuclear weapons installations safe. But they were also, Chernobyl was extremely threatening. Immediately, protesters throughout North America and Europe started calling for the shutdown of nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons programs and the disarmament of states and of installations in Germany, for instance, in Europe. And that threatened the whole enterprise of peaceful production of nuclear power and radiation medicine. So they felt like the biggest threat was not so much radioactive isotopes, but hysterical publics that would not be fully armed with proper education, proper knowledge, didn't know how to interpret this data, and would panic. So they were constantly trying to, stem panic. So when the World Health Organization sent in a commission, they sent in 3 scientists. They spent 5 days going to 7 different locations. And at the end of that period, they said, we don't see any health problems. And nobody took that seriously. What can you say in 5 days with 3 guys, mostly inside of cabs and airplanes?
Did they look at historical records? Or?
They had no time. They only had 5 days.
Yeah.
So then the International Atomic Energy Agency was asked by the Soviet leadership to do a study. They spent 18 months. They said they sent in 200 scientists, and they produce a much longer report, about 300 pages, that says the same thing. That we didn't find
anything. So now Kate Brown comes in, the historian, and I understand you've been poring over tens of thousands of documents, that you've been in the field. Can you talk about the process? You're now investigating and trying to find out what really happened, what the health and environmental impacts of Chernobyl really were. What does that entail?
Well, the first thing an historian does is go to the archive. And I walked into the archive in Kiev, and I asked for the Ministry of Health records on the Chernobyl disaster. And the archivist, who I've known for many years, laughed at me and said, "You're not going to find anything. That was a banned topic during the Soviet period. They didn't write anything about Chernobyl." I said, "Well, why don't I just look at the finding aids anyway?" And within a couple of minutes, whole document collections entitled in plain Ukrainian, "The Medical Consequences of the Chernobyl Catastrophe." And I started reading, and I haven't stopped.
So there is a record.
There's a huge record, yeah. Then I went on to Minsk and to provincial cities in Ukraine and Belarus, and I went to Moscow. And everywhere I went, I found a very similar story of doctors on the ground and sanitation and hygiene experts on the ground reporting two things. One, people were ingesting a great deal of radioactive isotopes in their food products, in the water, and in the ambient dust that was spreading everywhere. And the second thing that the doctors are reporting, and this really sort of picks up speed starting in 1988, is that people have these sort of strange, what they call a whole bouquet of medical problems.
How far out from the site are you seeing this type
probably
of
about
health effect?
From 30, they evacuated 30 kilometers around, from 30 to 80 kilometers around the site. But then there are other pockets farther out in Belarus, because the clouds went over Belarus. And what I'm finding is that Soviet Air Force pilots flew through those clouds, seeded them so that they rained, in sort of a triage scenario, and they rained down in Belarus before they got to the bigger Russian cities. So there's an awful lot of contamination in Belarus. 70% of the fallout fell there.
What do you really want people to take away from this, and what kind of policy adjustments do you think need to occur based on what you've seen and researched?
Well, right now the official tally for Chernobyl fatalities is 44 dead, and those were cleanup workers, emergency workers, firemen who died right after.
Immediate fallout, yeah.
Yeah, and then there's these 6,000 cases of cancer. I don't think anybody really believes that only 44 people died from Chernobyl. As you travel through these areas, just one person after another has a story to tell you. Oh, my husband worked, or my son worked on the cleanup, or my daughter was a doctor who was sent in, or wool workers who had to clean radioactive wool, people working in stockyards who had to kill radioactive animals.
Anyone exposed.
Everyone exposed. Yeah. And so, lots of stories of people dying and, 30, 40 years old. So it would be great to have a more realistic tally than these 44. And it would be wonderful if we could, even though it's been 30 years and a lot of time has passed, to finally have that long-term epidemiological study of the health effects of Chernobyl. We have wonderful tools now that we didn't have 30 years ago to try to use the body as an archive, to see how much radiation has been stored in the body and what kind of damage that it's done.
But I feel like even with the information we know, and even with the information you have in Plutopia, a lot of people might draw the conclusion that there's just such a huge potential cost to the production of plutonium or uranium, or the fuel of nuclear energy. I assume that's the conclusion you've drawn, that it's not worth it.
I don't think it's worth it. We don't have solutions to what to do with radioactive waste, which is why we have sullied environments. We don't have very good science about the problems of radioactive isotopes lodged in bodies and what happens to bodies. And I think until we can figure that out, for instance, right now, the state of Washington had this shocking case of the last 6 years, 45 women gave birth to anencephalic babies. That means babies born without heads. 45 cases is just a
That's extraordinary.
astonishing number. The background for that is 1 in a million or something. And so they did a study, the state epidemiologist did a study, and they thought, well, maybe it's nitrates. No, they canceled out nitrates. Maybe it's folic acid. No, they canceled that out. Maybe it's radiation. Because all the counties that had it, most of them were right around the 3 counties surrounding the Hanford plant. And they said, the Department of Energy said that no radiation leaves the site. The site is bounded by a cyclone fence. And as we know, radiation gets into the groundwater, it gets into the air, gases, it migrates through water.
There are no boundaries.
There are no boundaries, and it's extremely prolific.
And they're seeing that with Fukushima as well, right? They're seeing things turn up on the west coast of the United States that have been irradiated from Fukushima because it's one ocean that circulates, and we all breathe the same air.
Yeah, and what radioactive isotopes do is they mimic nutrients and minerals that plants and animals, organisms
feed
need
off of
to survive. And so they migrate towards life.
Wow.
And so foods that we eat, they go right up the food chain. If there's some radiation in the water, that gets biomagnified 1,000 times in the fish in the water.
Kate Brown, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Really fascinating.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics.